everyone, welcome back. My name is Brian, and in today's video we're going to be talking about using a smoothing plane to create a nice smooth surface. One of the problems you encounter when trying to do this is that you leave behind tracks in the surface. You can leave behind tracks in the surface when the edges of the plane tend to dig into the wood. So one thing that you can do is you can look at the back of your plane. You can see here up on the screen that there's a lateral adjustment on the back of your plane, and with the other picture that shows up now, you'll see that the lateral adjustment changes the angle of the blade within the mouth of the plane. And so back here on the sole, this helps to improve the surface finish, but if either of those edges protrudes just a tiny bit, then the problem you get is tracks in your surface. So the goal today is to show you how to get rid of those tracks and create a smoother surface. The picture you now see on the screen shows some of those tracks that I was talking about in the surface. I had already sharpened my plane whenever I had taken those pictures, and I had gone back and forth in changing the lateral adjustment, so irregardless of how sharp your plane is, you will still get those types of tracks unless you do one thing, and that one thing is that you create a camber in the blade of your plane. Now when I say camber, what I'm talking about is a slight curvature in our plane blade, so that way the edges do not dig in on the side. So a little camber is enough. We don't need a lot of camber. So the goal in our sharpening is going to be to create a camber, but we want this to be subtle. So in the end, I'll show you a picture of what this looks like, but in the sharpening process, we're going to do the most work with a coarse stone. I'm now disassembling the plane so I can sharpen it. I first remove the lever cap. I then remove the plane blade assembly, loosen but not completely take out the screw, and then rotate and remove the blade from the chip breaker. Here you can see I'm starting the sharpening process. Before I turned on the camera, I first flattened each of my water stones with a coarse diamond stone. My sharpening process then starts with this green coarse water stone. For each of the scenes you will see, I'm using the ruler trick, which is a very thin metal ruler that's laid down in order to not have to flatten the entire back of the plane. One mistake I make is I spray the metal ruler with water, and this causes it to stick to the back of the plane blade. I recommend you don't do this and you put the ruler down after you've sprayed the sharpening stone. After using the coarse stone, I use a 1000 grit medium stone, and this is followed by an 8000 grit fine stone. After flattening the back, I then put the plane blade in a honing jig. Using the honing jig requires the proper stick out length so I can sharpen the plane blade micro bevel. In the scenes that follow, you will see me using a 1000 grit and an 8000 grit sharpening stone. For each of these, I try to apply a pressure and do about 8 to 10 strokes on the outer part of the blade, and then 5 at an intermediate point and 3 in the middle. The goal of doing more strokes on the outer part of the blade is to create the camber, but I don't want to do too much at once, and I want to sneak up on the correct camber. The final step would be to remove the burr on the back side of the blade. Here you can take the plane blade out of the honing jig or leave it in, as I've done here. After sharpening, it's time to reassemble our hand plane and to test it out. When reassembling the plane, we want to make sure that the chip breaker doesn't rake across the edge that we just sharpened. This means we slide the chip breaker from the back towards the tip of the blade. We then tighten our blade assembly and insert it into the frog of our plane. Our lever cap is then installed, and we will still need to set the depth of our plane. Planing an edge is the easier of the two planing tasks that I'm interested in. Here you can see I make a couple light passes and remove some burn marks. So overall it looks good for planing the edge. I then turn to the more complicated task of smoothing a surface. Note that this was where I had problems in the past with leaving track marks with my smoothing plane. I've already set my lateral adjustment here, and I'm going through and trying to set the depth for my plane. I'm making several passes and trying to engage the plane blade while I'm moving on the surface. Since I've already sharpened the plane blade, this should allow me to create very thin shavings. This picture shows the results of our sharpening process so far. Here you can see we're still leaving behind tracks on the surface. However, these tracks are a little more subtle than the tracks that were being created before trying to create a camber. After realizing my plane was still leaving behind tracks, I realized that I needed to increase the camber. So what I did is I went back to the sharpening process, started with a coarse stone, did 10 strokes by putting 10 strokes of pressure on the outside, 5 strokes at an intermediate point, and 3 in the middle. Did this for each side. And then I went from the coarse stone, did the same thing for 1,000 grit stone, and also at the 8,000 grit level. In this first picture, I want to show you how subtle the camber is after resharpening. To highlight this, I've drawn a straight red line and also a curved red line that follows the edge of the blade. When I take away both the straight line and the curve, what you will see is just the camber, especially at the edge of the blade. I'm doing this to highlight the fact that the camber can be subtle and it doesn't have to be egregious. I've now installed my sharpened blade into the plane, and I go about the process of setting my depth and removing the track marks from before. During this process, I'm trying to go both at a 45-degree angle and also along the length of my board. This is a picture of our final surface, and here you can see we're no longer leaving behind tracks with our hand plane. One thing to note is that you will need to resharpen your blade in the future. When I do this, I will use the same number of strokes and pressure on each of the 5 locations of the blade. I do this because the goal is to keep the camber the same. Thank you for watching today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Hope the content of today's video will help you get more out of your hand planes, create smoother surfaces, and better enjoy your time in the shop.